Yeah, I think that will cut it, guys. So thank you for coming. My name is Lauren. I work with Queensland Transport and Logistics Council. We're an independent voice to inform and improve freight networks and outcomes for Queenslanders. But welcome to those of you who live outside Queensland, who seem to be the majority of the audience this afternoon. We, 3 years ago, in response to what we saw as a lack of information on transport, zero emission freight in Queensland, thought that we would put together a program, an accelerator program to provide advice, independent advice to hubs and their customers on the energy transition ahead. So Future Freight Energy Hub program was born, and for 3 years now it's been providing a platform to hubs and their customers to try out zero emissions models, share information and resources, particularly share learnings of customers who have taken early steps, and demonstrate leadership in new technology and sustainability. So we offer that through a range of forums. So with our partners Movement, and Dave and Mark are here today, we provide a series of newsletters on technology and adoption, early leaders. We provide a series of webinars, and you're at probably the fifth or sixth of those today. And we also have some grant money available for hubs who are looking to get bespoke information on what they need to do. So we've been working with some of the major hubs up here in Queensland. And I guess to that end, we were at one of these hub offerings where we had a zero emissions drive and ride day late last year, and we were talking to fleets and operators about what the mandatory emissions reporting things coming up were, what the timeframes were, and what they could do to prepare. And we got lots of blank looks in the audience. So that was probably cause for concern for us. And we completely understand that every company is different and everyone is at a different part of that process. But what we wanted to do is make sure that everyone had the facts on who was captured, what's going to be captured and when, importantly the timeframes, and about what different parts of the supply chain are doing now to get ready for freight emissions reporting. So today we thought through the webinar that we would bring you three of the leading experts in Australia on advising T&L companies about the change ahead. So we've got Dave Coleman from Movement, Michael Blake and Andrew Gunst joining us here today. We are, in terms of housekeeping, going to run each speakers sequentially. So we're going to hear from Dave, Andrew, and then Michael with questions at the end, about 20 minutes of questions we've got allocated. Of course, in Teams, we've got a chat function. So if you've got questions that are burning or you think that they can be answered easily, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll try and answer them as we go along. Otherwise, we'll try and get to them at the end. We'll be recording this webinar and making it available to some of you who weren't able to join this afternoon, or if you'd like to share it with your customers or fleet operators, it'll be on our website, along with the presentations and the PowerPoints given by each of the presenters today. So we're building quite a resource hub, and if you go to QTLC's website, you'll see all the future newsletters, which we'll be talking about today as well. Some of the content is relevant to the subject matter we're dealing with today. And you'll be able to grab those PowerPoints and that sort of thing there. Each of the presenters will put their contact details at the end of the PowerPoints, and we're happy to take questions from the audience thereafter. Importantly, also, this Future Freight Energy Hub program is drawn and built on what you need. So we want to be responsive to that. And to that end, if you've got thoughts about what we should tackle next, either in a written article or a webinar or some other fashion, pop it in the chat, send me an email or give us a call thereafter. So the first speaker today that we're going to hear from is Dave Coleman. So Dave's been stalked by me on LinkedIn over the last hour, and I didn't realise that he has been working for a long time in transport and logistics, so both for multinational miners and oil companies in supply chain optimisation, and more recently advising a whole range of T&L companies on energy and carbon emissions. So he's now working with Movement, and I'm lucky enough to work with him day in, day out, and he's going to be presenting first to us today on how do we measure greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we show improvement as this freight task continues to grow for us. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I'll just get my slides up. If you can let me know when they appear and
they're up, Dave.
Okay. Excellent. So, hello everyone. Great to speak with you today on how to report carbon emissions in freight transport. I guess up until now, carbon's only really been measured by engineers or scientists or economists or carbon advisors. So fleet managers haven't had to worry about it or even try to understand it. But what's changed this year is the accounting profession has taken control of greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So the new laws on disclosure mean that this reporting is now very much becoming mainstream. By the 2030s, which is only a few years away, many businesses across all the sectors of the economy will have two standard company reports, one on their financial performance and one on emissions. So emissions accounting is a very appropriate term, and it's the new normal. So today I'll give you an overview of the basics of emissions accounting and what it means for the logistics industry. But first, we'll start with how we got to here. Here's a timeline of when global standards were established and the main Australian programs were introduced over the last 25 years. I won't go through them all here. We did a bit of an overview in the latest QTLC newsletter on future freight energy hubs that we issued this month that Lauren just mentioned. But I will explain how reporting, particularly for logistics, has developed over that time. So it starts back in 2001 with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Now, this is the Bible of emissions accounting. It set all the rules for companies on how to measure, how to report. It defines all the concepts, the terms, the methods for how to do that. And it's used by virtually every corporate greenhouse gas reporting program in the world today. And the Australian programs there all align with the principles of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And then in 2013, there was a group of multinational logistics providers and their big corporate customers who got together and formed the Global Logistics Emissions Council, or GLEC. And their aim was to agree common methods for how suppliers from all those companies can gather and share and report data throughout their supply networks in a common format. So the GLEC framework came out in 2016, and then that later became the basis for the ISO standard 14083, which is how to report transport emissions. That came out in 2023. So here we are in 2025 in Australia. We've got mandatory climate reporting has just commenced. ASIC, the Australian Security Investment Commission, they call it the biggest change to financial reporting and disclosure in a generation. So carbon is now firmly entrenched in the accounting system. Carbon can have a price, it can have a cost. It'll be on your profit and loss statement. It'll be an asset or a liability in your balance sheet. And reporting it is here to stay because it's really the only way to know if you're ever going to achieve net zero. So, So first, what is carbon? There's 6 greenhouse gases in that cloud in the graphic, and they're all reduced down to one unit of measure, which is CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent. And really, that's just carbon in many people's usage. So the graphic shows that there's many sources of emissions across the whole value chain of a company, and they're broken into 3 types of sources called scopes. So scope 1 is what's directly emitted from assets you control, that green line in the middle there. So your vehicles, your buildings, your sites. And then the other 2 indirect emissions that come from outside of your control. They occur elsewhere. So when you buy electricity through the grid, the emissions happen somewhere else. That's the grey arrow there. And then all your scope 3 activities, both upstream and downstream of your company. It's all the activities you're involved with, all the goods and services you buy to make your operation run. So with freight customers are going to be particularly concerned about scope 3 inbound transport. So that's on the left. So that's the supply of all inputs and materials that go into a production process. And then on the other side of that is the outbound distribution of those finished products out to the market. So they're the 2 transport elements that freight customers are most concerned about in relation to logistics fleets reporting on these activities. And to define what your actual carbon footprint is, the first step is to set your boundaries, and that will tell you and tell others what's in and what's out of your footprint. So there's three types of boundaries. The first is organisational. So what is the entity that's reporting? Does it include its subsidiaries or not? What activities does that entity do? And you can you can pick an organisational boundary based on either your equity share in a business or whether you have financial control of that business. But what's most common is whether you have operational control of that business. And then you set an operational boundary. So that's the second step. And that's where you decide which of these sources of emissions to be included, because every company and sector is different. Some emission sources are more material than others. So you set your operational boundary. And then the third boundary is the time period. So, a greenhouse gas report quantifies emissions over a period of time, usually a year. But you need a reporting period and also a reference period to compare your progress against. So that's your baseline. That's how you track emissions over time with your time boundary. So the key thing for logistics fleets to understand with all this, who might be a bit new to it, is that your scope 1 emissions there in the middle, they're going to be somebody else's scope 3 emissions. So you'll be asked by multiple parties for emissions data just on their particular activities that you handle. And it's actual data from your operations, which is what should be used by carriers and logistics site operators to calculate emissions. It's, actual data is also the type of data that, transport buyers, your customers, should aim to collect from their service providers to calculate their scope 3 emissions. Real actual data is gold. And so that's primary data. That sits at the top of the pyramid that I've got there on the right. So it's real, it's accurate, it's based on your particular activities. But it can be hard to get primary data, often from within your own organisation and data systems, let alone from your contractors and your suppliers. So what do you do when you need to report? Well, you need a fallback, and that's using secondary data. So this is data that's not specific to your activities. It's proxy data. So it's not as reliable, but it does give you a number to report with some basis of truth behind it. Now, secondary data comes in two forms: modelled data. So this is where you've got, you can use information that you have available to you on, what you carry, where you move it, how you do that, and you can model that to estimate your energy use and therefore your emissions. So you can see the basis of truth is straight out of your activities. But then you have default data where you can't even get that far. And so, this default data has their industry averages. They have the lowest accuracy and reliability, but there are lots of default data points out there that you can use when you're getting started. So they are used very commonly, but they are the lowest reliability of any source of data. So when you do your report, you need to, be sure you're using reputable sources where you're getting these industry averages from or where you're getting your own activity data from. And you must clearly state what those sources are and any assumptions that you've used in your reporting. So now, how do you calculate emissions? So in its very simplest form, there's just two things: quality times quantity. And so the quantity is how much transport activity you have. And the quality is how green is that activity. So that green activity is represented by an emission factor. The emission factor specifies the amount in weight of carbon per unit of activity. So this is also called emissions intensity. So emissions factor, emissions intensity, they're interchangeable. So at the top of that pyramid on the left, which is showing the three activity calculation methods, primary data on fuel litres, again, sits on top. It's the most accurate. And in the table, I'm trying to give an example to compare these methods. So you can see that first line, we have an absolute or total emissions result is 33.9 tonnes over in the right-hand column. And so that's based on using 10,000 litres of diesel, which I've just picked as a number for the example. So 10,000 litres of diesel, 33.9 tonnes of carbon in total. But you can see there's two emission factors, and this is how the scopes apply to fuel emissions in particular. So scope 1 is the emissions that come out of your tailpipe when the fuel is burnt in the vehicle. And we call that the tank to wheel emissions. Whereas the Scope 3 emissions factor, they're all the upstream emissions from how you get the fuel in the first place. So they drill for oil, they produce it, it gets refined, it gets transported from the refinery out to a truck stop or to the bulk tank in your depot. So all those emissions are upstream of the fuel use, and they're called well to tank, and they're your Scope 3 fuel emissions. So when you combine the two together, that covers the full energy life cycle, and we call that well to wheel. So you'll hear about that more perhaps from Michael. But if you can't get fuel data from your suppliers, or you might have to account for multiple customers on one truck when you're doing less than truckload activity, what do you do then? And so that's where the distance-based activity method comes in, and this is where you calculate based on the tonne kilometres that you move. So when you move 1 tonne, 1 kilometre, that's 1 tonne kilometre. So how many tonnes of cargo have you carried, and how many kilometres have you carried that? That gives you tonne kilometres, and then you apply an emissions factor based on the mode of transport that you've used and then the type of vehicle. So here you can see I've used a rigid truck that's carried 130,000 tonne kilometres of cargo at 0.26 kilograms per tonne kilometre. So that gives us the 33.8 tonnes of carbon, which is near the 10,000 number above. And so then you look down to the spend-based method at the bottom, and this is your absolute last resort. But it's simple, so that's why it's used so much. So an emissions intensity per dollar of business spend. So here we've got a bit over $31,000 spent on road freight. That'll give you a result. That'll give you 33.9 tonnes of carbon, which matches the other two thereabouts. So it'll give you a number, but spend-based has its drawbacks. It's too imprecise to be meaningful in any way. There's lots of uncertainty, up to 80% or more uncertainty with any spend-based emission factors. And when you use that, you can't actually use it to identify any ways to reduce your carbon intensity. So just to the last slide now, it's carbon intensity that freight customers are really going to want to see after all. So it's emissions intensity, which is the way that you should track and analyse and even strategise your emissions reduction, because your own emissions intensity lets you showcase your efficiency. So as your business grows, you become more efficient. That can get resolved in that number, and it allows you to communicate progress towards your targets. So when you look at that chart on the left, that shows a lot of ranges of some default distance-based emission factors that come out of the GLAC framework. These are all rated in, well-to-wheel grams of CO2e per tonne kilometre. So when you look at the top there, you can see, the greenest freight modes we all know are marine and rail freight. So they have the lowest emissions intensity ranges. Aviation we know is the highest carbon intensity. But you can see there's a fair range between different types of aviation. But what's really interesting for a road freight audience, if that's what we have, is all the different ranges of intensity depending on the size of the vehicle. So from the largest heavy goods vehicles, which is the top grey one on the left for road, all the way down to the small delivery vans, you can see that the higher, the bigger the vehicle, the higher tonnage capacity of the train, of the vessel, of the vehicle, the lower and better the emissions intensity will be. So just this chart in itself, these are indicative ranges. They're based on various studies that all sit behind each and every emission factor, default emission factor that you will use. It's always based on something, but whatever that study is, it will have little bearing on your specific activities. So only you can determine your own actual emissions intensity. So in this new normal of emissions reporting that we have now, the main goal is to beat the emissions factor. Because your emissions intensity is what differentiates you from your competitors. It's the ultimate measure of green transport. So, and even if your business is growing and your emissions are growing in absolute terms, if your emissions intensity is coming down over time, then, that's how you're going to demonstrate progress to net zero targets. So I think I'm about on the money for time there, Lauren. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I've got a few questions, but as we agreed, we'd hold them to the end. Jackson couldn't hold his in, so he's popped his in the chat, and feel free to answer it as we go. So if you've got questions like Jackson, pop them in the chat. But now we're going to move on to Andrew Gunst. Andrew's the CEO of consultancy Resource Intelligence. They provide bespoke carbon and energy advice to clients, particularly T&L clients. So might range from carbon emission statements to obtaining carbon credits for energy efficiency projects or even fuel switching. Andrew, we're really keen to hear from you, and your topic today is what's needed for mandatory climate reporting and how do you earn carbon credits? Looking forward to it.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Are you okay to drive the slides?
We can do that for you.
Very good. Okay, well, first slide, please. Very good. Might as well flip straight to the second slide. Great, thanks. So today I want to run through three things before the questions. What's changed and why we think it won't really go away regardless of political change. What you need to do and when and why it seems to be so difficult and expensive. That'll be very much building on what Dave just said. And then thirdly, how could you profit from this? Next slide, please, Lauren. And the next slide. Next slide again. Yep, and so next slide again, please. Okay, so the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard that Dave's been talking about, it is phased in over 7 years. Lauren, next slide, please. And reporters are grouped into three, 1, 2 and 3, called unoriginally that. Group 1 is the biggest, and you're in Group 1 if you tick 2 or 3 of those 3 questions, 500 million or more revenue, assets of more than $1 billion or more than 500 employees, or you're an NGR reporter. Probably for most of this audience, the main interest will be Group 3, which is the lowest line in the table. When you look at it, those numbers look pretty big, but actually for a mid-size transport and logistics company, it's not hard to have 25 million or more of gross assets, given the cost of prime movers, etc. And including drivers, it's not that hard to go to 100 or more employees. So worthwhile checking. You might be in Group 3. Regardless, and next slide, please, Lauren. The most important thing, and if you leave this talk and forget about me and get nothing else from this talk, I'd really like you to understand the impact of that blue circle on the time and who does what table here. So as the years roll on, Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 will be exposed to first limited assurance on their report and then reasonable assurance. For those of you who haven't had the joy of a compliance audit, a limited assurance audit is where the auditor signs off to say, I haven't found anything wrong. A reasonable assurance means that they sign off and say, and we believe your report, which clearly is higher risk for them, higher insurance cost, and more probing. So Scope 3 emissions are the Scope 3 emissions for the Group 1, Group 2, Group 3 parties. What that means is if you have a pretty big customer, they might be, say, Group 3, Group 2, or even Group 1. So they're going to be responsible for reporting on Scope 3 emissions in their second year, which for Group 2 is next year, 1 year later for Group 2, 1 year later for Group 3. That means that even though you might not fall into Group 3, your bigger customer will need your Scope 1 data, as David's explained, in year 2, which means next year. So please feel free to come back and ask me about this table later on in the questions if you want to. But like I said, their Scope 3, your client's Scope 3 emissions might mean you're reporting earlier, in fact, at all. Next slide, please, Lauren. The other sleeper in here is the safeguard mechanism. Only some transport companies are safeguard mechanism facilities, but future regulatory attention as the decline of the safeguard mechanism baselines cuts in, they're likely to start to ask, well, if you've got some freight that's really only servicing your facility, perhaps it should be inside your facility boundary and your scope 1 emission. Feel free to come back and ask me on that later on the questions if you wish. Next slide, please, Lauren. So why we think it's not going to go away. We are about to enter a federal election, and the federal opposition has said that they have a policy to repeal ASRAs and downgrade the safeguard mechanism if elected. But it's important to realise there are two groups, not one, pushing for ASRA's data. There's the community green groups, and they have their political representatives. But above all, it's the finance sector. And why is that? Well, the finance sector has, from early days of Bloomberg pushing this, have wanted a tons of carbon per widget or per tonne kilometre of freight or whatever the unit of measure is. So they can then forecast, okay, if we've got a cost curve for carbon going forward, and we know the tonnes of carbon per widget going forward, we can multiply one by the other and see which entities have the biggest carbon price exposure, and therefore where we should think about risk in terms of loans or equity. So we think there's going to be demand for this data regardless of whether there's a repeal. If the transport customer is consumer facing or needs finance, or if the transport fleet itself needs finance. Next slide, please, Lauren. And just a bit of a war story into going into why people have persisted up until now, even before its compliance. So I was speaking to a mid-tier operator recently, and they said, Andrew, it's not that the financier, the lender, won't sort of, and ah about the data we're proposing. Now, they won't even come to the meeting unless we send them our emissions data first. So what do you need to do and why is it so difficult and expensive? Lauren, next slide, please. Now, David's already taken you through the details of how you go from data to tons of CO2e. And he said, and probably if there's a second bit I really want you guys to get from this talk is your reporting boundary, and hence emission streams you need to report, is a matter of opinion, not a matter of fact. And when it comes to scope 3, it's particularly grey. How do you estimate the emissions embedded in vehicles and fuel? David's shown you there's some lookup factors, but you'll probably want something better than that. When it comes to employee commute, offices, and of course staff accommodation, when your drivers are out on the road, how do you go about estimating that? And the big one for the transport sector, for those of you who transport products which themselves create emissions when they're used. So think transporting petrol, gasoline, transporting diesel, transporting coal. When those products are used, how responsible are you for those emissions, and are they in fact part of your scope 3 boundary? And if you look on public reports, you'll see there's a lot of opinion about that. So professional opinion is needed, and what you really need in the end is a carefully worded justification document that's compliance audit resistant. Next slide, please, Lauren. So I thought third, I'd go with something that might actually be cheery. And this is how you could earn from it. Next slide, please, Lauren. So over the past 7 or 8 years, David and I particularly have been engaged in helping fleet operators, responsible for about 13,000 vehicles, earn 5-figure amounts per year, predominantly from energy efficiency and fuel switching. A couple of examples here which the operators are okay with us sharing are Australia Post moving to electric vehicles. They've got thousands of these on the road now. Perhaps one's dropping off letters to your house these days. And ships particularly on the Victoria to Tasmania route, have been earning Australian carbon credit units. If you are working for in transport for a safeguard mechanism facility, and those of you in the audience who are doing that will know that you can create safeguard mechanism credits in actually a simpler way. And this is real now. This is the last week of March. So our first transport operator is having to submit and pay in either Australian carbon credits or safeguard mechanism credits, having previously been able to generate some of those. So this is the week where the rubber hits the road. Next slide, please, Lauren. And that's me, and on to questions.
Andrew, best 15-minute presentation I've seen on a complicated topic in a while, but a bit of a Pandora's box, and I think the questions in chat show that. So we've got a lot of people with that have started to put questions in there. If you're able to answer those easily as we move on to Michael, that'd be great. But otherwise, guys, keep putting your questions in, and if you can also just add who they're directed to, that would be make it easiest for us at the end. So we're moving on now to Michael. Michael's the founder and CEO of Zilch Forwarding and Lateran Metrics. Michael's had 8 years of experience in logistics decarb and 25 in global trade. He's dedicated to reducing emissions in logistics, and he's going to talk to us today about how better data impacts emissions reporting in an international supply chain. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. Just you can see my screen okay there?
We got it.
Cool. So yeah, as Lauren says, I've been 25 years in shipping and global transport, and the last 8 years working in the transport decarbonisation space. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey. You can imagine 8 years ago, bumping into Dave Coleman, I think for the first time at a carbon market event, being the only two transport logistics fellows there. It was yeah, very early days, and not a lot of understanding around logistics and carbon and the relationship. So I guess through our work, we've seen the challenges the businesses are facing around this particular topic, because we faced them ourselves back then some time ago, and perhaps could be said where the pathway wasn't as clear. It was just after the time, as Dave touched on, that the Global Logistics Emissions Council framework was even established. So these were the sort of Wild West. I still call some of this still the Wild West in this sustainability space, particularly around carbon, with the, I guess, requirement for more detailed frameworks and regulation, obviously still being on the horizon. So yeah, again, we can probably I can resonate with what companies are going through on the other side, because it is a complex topic, and there are very, quite a few elements to it. I guess what I'm hoping to do today is just give you a bit of an overview of, I guess, some of those challenges, some of the, I guess, ways we approach it, and then a little case study, which is a real world example of what we've seen doing our work. So the challenge around logistics emissions reporting. So there's obviously a growing need for accurate data. So I was just reflecting on a couple of the presentations as they were going on, and particularly Dave's, in relation to, we're still very much talking about getting the reporting data right, or starting the reporting, when we might well feel that we should be really ripping into driving emissions out of supply chains. And obviously there's a lot of discussion around decarbonisation, but in reality we're really at the reporting stage, and that's I guess perhaps a bit of an issue for the industry, but obviously transport is known to be a hard to abate sector. We have assets that have long life cycles, if you like, being trucks and ships, so it's a complex issue. So from our perspective, there's been a very traditional approach. It's around high level emissions reporting. That's been governed by, I guess, the sector and reporting of emissions, particularly in logistics, sitting within the environmental consulting sector, not sort of transport specialised operators, where there's been a propensity to allow this to sort of go on for a period of time, where we really feel that it's time now for the sector to sort of step in a little bit and provide, expert advice around logistics is a complex topic because there are lots of moving parts, pardon the pun. And when you start to look at the carbon side of things, it's really needs, I guess what I'm saying here is there's a role for the logistics sector to play to work with sustainability to understand and get the right sort of insights and action that's required. I guess we observe, and as you know, probably what today is about also is that a lot of businesses struggle to determine where to start. Whether that's using primary data, as sort of Dave touched on, which is kind of the in some ways the utopia, but it can be a little bit misleading to start because it might sort of stifle progress over going for that sort of perfect result. So I think it's important that we sort of take that mindset in this stuff is a progress over perfection approach, keeping in mind that primary data in due course will be the ultimate, but we're not there yet. And that sort of goes into my point that it's only really it's not widely available, primary data, and I guess we've also got to look at methodology alignment when that data is available. So again, it's a complex topic. One of the key things that I talk about quite a bit is carbon literacy in logistics, and I think that this will become a core competency within logistics practitioners, both those, I guess, on the trucking side, but also on the shipper side. So the cargo, the freight procuring of logistics services, having an understanding of both the freight that they procure from their service providers and what it means in relation to carbon and as Dave touched on, working with a transport provider that has a lower carbon intensity to the other. We're not at that point yet, but this is sort of, I think, where the sector needs to move to. So the role of better data and emissions reporting is obviously critical, and I guess if we drill into a little bit more about why that's the case, we've over our sort of 8 years and done collaborations with Swinburne University and some commercial partners. And from my background, having worked in the digital space myself, briefly in supply chain tech, it's been really focused on granularity. So getting to the, I guess the bottom of the numbers is really important to then be able to sort of get the reporting at the right sort of level and level of accuracy, as Andrew touched on with the incoming accounting standard changes and the movement around assurance. Having high level estimates is sort of the times are changing. We need to get to granularity, and for us that was always to get things at a consignment level. So whether you're on the shipper side or the trucking side, and both have a different view to it and responsibility in this, is that take it from the trucking side, it's having consignment level data available for your customers is important to be able to segment who owns what in that carbon inventory, if that makes sense. And the flip side from a shipper perspective is I just want to be able to pluck my portion out of that transport operator's overall footprint and be able to sort of ingest that into the business. As I touched on, moving beyond industry averages is going to become more and more important, both from a regulatory perspective, but as we start to drive optimization, if we're using loose numbers to start with, optimization, we really can't be guided as to what we're achieving. And I guess we see this happening in across the sector. Talking about alternative fuels and are absolutely a critical part of the transition. But it's also important to have good data to start with around our fossil footprint to then be able to meaningfully identify what these investments and change actually do to any sort of carbon footprint. And lastly, on this, I guess, methodology. So the Europeans and globally have been looking at this for over 10 years and developed frameworks and methodology that are globally recognised under the Science Based Target Initiative and throughout Europe. Less awareness here, so I think also talking about GLEC and ISO is an important step forward for the sector down here. Not to throw another methodology at everyone, but these I think are good guiding principles as they're sort of tried and tested in another part of the world that's done a little bit more, perhaps a little bit further down the path than what we are. Just going to touch on a case study that we were involved with here under our Zilch business, which is a freight business. We work with customers on not only moving the freight, but also getting really granular insights into the emissions, and then surfacing that data so that our customers can just make better decisions around what they want to do, or also just validate the numbers that they've already got at their fingertips. So in this particular case, we were introduced by a third party on the basis that the client had sort of done some work. They'd done some, if you call it the first step, around a spend-based analysis. So when we come back to where do businesses start around this, it might be spend base is where they're at now. And I'm probably going to, this is looking at it from the shipper side, I guess. So this is a freight consumer that has a freight task, that has a spend-based carbon accounting method, which is presenting some data and some numbers around their logistics emissions. It was identified that the logistics emissions were an area of not concern, but wanting to dig a little deeper. And that we were introduced to the business. They're also certified under Climate Active, so I'm sure some people or most people are aware of Climate Active being the carbon neutral standard under the government's program. So there was not only I guess a reporting impetus, but also a cost impetus in the sense that if they were overstating emissions, there was a direct cost around procurement of credits around that carbon neutral certification to get that certification. So, and I guess the last thing there is around having that spend-based methodology where we just have no relationship to the activity is there's no real way, clearly there's no real way to influence that or understand if certain parts of the supply chain are less efficient or more efficient than others. So there's no way to move forward. So the initial solution was really simple, and I guess we keep coming back to this, that in the first instance, getting the data right could be the first best step before we even need to think about optimization, electric trucks, biofuels. Getting data right in this instance particularly provided a significant uplift. So we simply took a hold of the freight task and through our operational business were able to deliver a freight solution which gave us insights into how the product was moving, to then be able to leverage that data to push it through our modelling tool, which is Later in Metrics, our sister company. So moving from the spend base into, okay, each shipment, we're now looking into, points of origin, destination, truck types, whatnot, to then get again, a really detailed assessment of each shipment as it moves through the supply chain. What that delivered was, and we'll call it a reduction for the sake of the exercise, a 60% reduction in emissions based on their previous reporting period. We looked at particular trade lanes. So a significant improvement on what had previously been reported. I think one of the, obviously one of the issues with the spend-based method is, and depending on what's happening in the freight market at any given time, that has a direct relationship to your emissions profile. So this might have been coming out of the back of the pandemic, and if everyone knows, everyone will recall in the freight sector what happened through that period around freight pricing. So again, linking it back to activity and even more so back to an intensity metric was really important. So the key outcomes there are, enhanced climate active and shareholder reporting accuracy. So the first thing is that we're now more comfortable about these numbers and to share these numbers and to report these numbers. And as an ASX listed company, that becomes, that's critical. It now gives us a view to the supply chain where we can identify areas that we want to start to optimize or perhaps are ripe for intervention, because we have a better state of a better view of the as-is emissions of the sort of supply chain. Another key outcome was the reduced cost for on the carbon crediting side of the business, which was obviously a direct cost impact and money going back into their sort of bottom line. So I think the more time that we spend working with similar customers, the more and more we see this type of scenario. We've just picked one today. In reality, they can move the other way. and that's not necessarily as in emissions can be understated, and that's not, from my experience, usually around yeah, it's typically around not having the full picture of the logistics task, and this is sort of where the expertise around understanding supply chains and sustainability merging together becomes really important, because what we've seen in the past is that if the logistics or supply chain expertise is not coupled with the environmental expertise, and particularly around carbon accounting, dealing with things like Incoterms and different truck types and whatnot, things can be missed or misinterpreted, so therefore they're actually left out of the carbon accounting practice or reporting. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there with about a minute to spare and throw it back to you. All right.
Thanks, Michael. That's excellent. A few more questions coming up, and now's your time. We have nearly half an hour for questions, and I see that Dave has actually managed to answer a fair few of them in the Q&A chat. So if you'd like to see those answers pop along there, I think he's answered nearly all of them. But Michael, just straight off the back of that presentation, if you had some advice to give to, say, a company just starting their journey in emissions reporting, what do you think their first step should be?
I guess it depends whether you're on the shipper side or the trucking side. Obviously, for a shipper, it's a potentially a scope 3 emission, and for a trucking company, it's a scope 1. So on the shipper side, whenever I guess we've followed companies on their journey over the last 8 years, and quite often when we'll go to a large freight consumer shipper, it'll be a question of how material is transported in your scope 3 category. So Dave popped up the chart before about the different scope 3 categories. There are 15 of them, and not always is transport the highest priority. So that's the first question: how material are your transport emissions, and is this worth chasing yet? Not that I'm sort of trying to chase business away, but invariably, if we get caught in a discussion where transport's not material, it's not the right time. So that's the first question: is it material, and how have we gone about it? But once we can validate that it is time to look at transport, it's a material element, then I guess it's working through. Our approach is to leverage existing data before chasing primary, albeit depending on the supply chain and how many counterparties and whatnot, it might be available. But again, we're looking to get deep insights quickly, and we leverage technology to do that. So that would sort of be our approach on that front. And from a transport company perspective, again, it's probably about yeah, I always look at it from what the customer's needs are also. So from a trucking company, are your customers asking you for this information? Are they the type of industries that are going to be quickly drawn into this accounting standards changes or regulatory changes, or are your customers driving demand? So for instance, in the fashion sector, there's an end requirement for a fashion consumer to be wanting to be purchasing, all the stats will show people are willing to spend more. I don't know that they are for sustainable products, but just understanding those relationships. And then I guess from a reporting perspective, this is probably into Dave's wheelhouse from a trucking company, but there would be a process to go through looking at what sort of primary data is available. If primary data is not available, then what's the next level down from that, which would be probably moving into modeling or whatnot. But yeah, I'm not sure if that directly answers the question, but or talk to somebody that's in the space, because it is a absolute minefield, and there's unfortunately not a lot of players in the space yet, but there's lots of knowledge with the likes of Dave and Andrew, that the players that are already here.
And Dave and Andrew, there's been a couple of questions in the chat about how to get different sources of data for different truck types. Can you speak to the answers you've provided there a little?
For the different truck types, so that was the question in the chat, particularly was around those distance-based emission factors. So the collect framework, which I mentioned earlier on, that is a document that explains all aspects of emissions reporting, and at the back of that they have a whole range of emission factors all around the world, globally, and all modes of transport, all different vessel sizes, plane sizes, train sizes, and of course vehicles. And that even breaks it down by region: the USA, Europe, South America. The factors are different. So, but the factors they have in there for Australia are quite generic, I guess. So what a lot of people use is the British factors. So in there's only two countries that provide these factors for free to the public, France and Britain. So in Australia, a lot of the Scope 3 reporting, particularly for climate active, in the early days was using the UK factors. But at the moment, if you want Australian factors, the Climate Active Carbon Neutral program provides them, but you need to pay to be part of that program and go through a whole carbon neutral certification process to get access to those factors. So they're not freely available from the government.
Yeah, thanks. I might just add to that if I can, and morph into the next question, which is from Brent Stafford regarding tailpipe emissions measurement. So the measurement methodology which underpins this does recognise the ability to measure in tailpipe or in a flue of a power station or whatever the case may be. It's called Method 4. So the Americans call it Tier 4, we call it Method 4. So that is allowed for. In the case of liquid fuels for transport, it's not one of the options. You're restricted to Methods 1 and 2. But the measurement methodology sets out a way for that to be allowed. What's needed basically is for the people who issue amendments to that each year to be confident that there is a viable method for available out there for the transport sector.
And to that end, Andrew, Brent's also sort of hinted at the big investment that lots of fleets are making now into telematics, not for this purpose, but for other purposes like road access. To what extent do you think telematics will play a role in this going forward?
Yeah, it's huge. It is the future. And if you look at another transport sector, aviation, most larger planes now flying have minute-by-minute data, and they are using that and have done for a number of years now. So yeah, the examples are out there in other transport sectors.
Thanks, Andrew. Michael, there's a question from you, from Jackie King. Michael, thanks for mentioning the need to decarb freight as well as report on emissions. To what extent will emissions reporting be the driving force for freight decarb efforts in freight in Australia, do the panel think? Interested for any insights on how this will play out, what else is needed to speed things up with emissions reduction, the carrot or the stick?
It's a good question. Thanks, Jacqueline. I think, again, let's sit on the shipper side for a second. I think one of the challenges we've seen here is that because the shippers lack insights into the true state of emissions now, they don't really know how to negotiate a better outcome with their transport providers. So if we, and I commonly hear this, and I was in a call yesterday, I think, where the sort of freight consumer said, to put it that way, we'll probably just wait to see how our transport company decarbonises. And the reality is that the transport sector is not going to decarbonise unless they see these demand signals from their customers. So the answer is, with reporting, you can give your customer a view to where it is now. If I'm talking from a trucking perspective, if you provide them insights and data as to what the emissions profile looks like now, they'll start to assess how that maps against their sort of decarbonisation roadmap. And at some point, the penny will drop that this is not going to be a free exercise on the shipper side, that they will have to be involved in investment to drive decarbonisation, whether that's through electric trucks, biofuels or whatnot. So that all, I guess, the enabler there is the data for them, provide the data initially to them to realise at some point that this needs to be a joint effort and jointly funded by both the shipper and trucking companies to get to where we need to be by some of these 2030 gateposts. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but that's my sort of take on things.
And I'll back that up, Michael, and say it's about the shipper driving the data requirements, that and having to be involved in the solutions of the decarbonisation as well. As you said about being involved in biofuels or electric trucks, if there's a green premium, it's up to a customer to pay that, or it won't be implemented. So in the old world, or the old normal, from a shipper's point of view, they go out to the market and expect the market to come back with the solutions. But in freight decarbonisation, it needs partnerships and an ecosystem to bring all these solutions to the table to put them into place. So shippers really have to drive that now, and so driving the technology adoption and the practices just overlays neatly with emissions reporting as well, because they're the numbers everyone will be judged on. And I think I might even flag to Andrew now to probably answer the next part of that, which is about the safeguard mechanism. And from a mandatory legislation point of view, the mechanism is in place, and the thresholds can be ratcheted down to capture more companies. So what would you like to say on that, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about it, using the same terminology, if another party comes into the picture and inserts a price signal, then suddenly it's worthwhile doing that. So and that's really exactly what the safeguard mechanism is. It's the federal government inserting a price signal on bigger facilities, which can include transport, and perhaps in the future will be more forced to include transport. So by inserting that price signal, by having a declining baseline, the amount you get for free is going down every year, then essentially, regardless of whether your immediate customer sends you a price signal or a willingness to pay, perhaps there's one coming in from another party. And when you think about it, the example that Michael was posing about Lark Distillery and climate active carbon neutral, in a way, that's another third party signal. It's saying, okay, well, if you want to be carbon neutral, you're going to have to buy carbon permits. So now you've got an interest in going for lower emissions transport.
Thanks, guys. I guess while we've got you, we were promised lots of case studies, and Andrew, you deal with a lot of T&L companies. I'm keen to hear what you've seen, like what transport fleets have generated carbon credits and actually made some dollars out of this. Tell us what you're seeing and what the good and the bad and the ugly is.
Yeah, okay. So the easiest one is where somebody's got an opportunity to do fuel switching. So shipping, coastal shipping, so Victoria, Tasmania, or out to oil rigs is a classic example of this, where by moving to methane, natural gas, away from fuel oil or diesel, they can report decreased emissions and therefore claim. Or you've got Australia Post, as I put in that picture, moving to bikes. But that's not to say that there aren't quite a number of operators who've just been able to do better with their existing equipment, often by, the regular stuff, driver training or route optimization, those sorts of things. Sometimes there is some low-hanging fruit there which enables them to claim carbon credits. Sometimes it's in areas where the operator truly has a lot of ability to influence that. So think shuttle operations from perhaps a Queensland coal mine or sugar operation to a port, or they're operating some sort of a service like garbage collection, something like that, where they've got an area and they can manage the route themselves. They're not dictated to by the client in terms of delivery windows. And so they've got an opportunity to reduce emissions.
Thanks. Is there anyone in the audience that struggled to write their question down and would like to ask their question? We've got a little bit of time and the panelists are all still with us. Feel free to take yourself off mute and pop it in there.
And just in the meantime, Lauren, I'll just follow on from Andrew's comments there, because you asked sort of about the good, bad and the ugly as well. And, when you're out talking to fleets who are interested in carbon credits, you have some, there's two sorts of fleets. One are not interested at all, and then the other half are. And then the half that are, I think they've got good projects. And when you get into it, it's all about the data. So they could be doing fantastic projects, but have very poor data, so they can't get to the gate in the first place. And we've even found some companies who had good data and had good projects, and the numbers went backwards. for a whole lot of reasons. So their emissions savings that they thought they were getting weren't there, and they weren't looking in the data the same way, I guess, as the carbon credit method looks at the data. So yeah, there's a lot of people who think they can get there, but it's the data that holds them back.
Thanks, Dave. I also had a question about if you're getting primary data from suppliers, how do you trust or verify that data?
Well, you need to understand their process for going through the for getting the data to you. What does the number represent? Where does it come from? What are the data sources? And you need to ask that from all suppliers supplying you emissions data. And of course, if their process is to use telematics, for instance, or to use fuel cards, for instance, one or the other, having one source of data is one thing, but you can't take it on face value. So you really need to have a sense check of data sources and compare, say, your fuel card data versus your telematics versus your driver paperwork or your maintenance records or whatever it may be, to become more sure about that data. And I guess with if a shipper has, I don't know, half a dozen companies reporting and two of them are very similar but coming up with very different numbers, that's another way to check is, are they all in the ballpark or are some wildly different? And if they're wildly different, why? And I think down the track, as Andrew alluded to there's going to be some sort of auditing requirements at some point, whether that's an official, reasonable or limited assurance audit, or whether it's just shippers going out to one reporter a year saying, well, let's go right through how this data got to us and go through that with them, and it's a learning exercise for everybody.
Yeah. Jackson's posted another question up there for the panel. How far away are we from the point of having a lower carbon intensity in your service is either one, a competitive advantage, or two, being a price to pay or ticket to play in the market?
I'm happy to jump in there if you like, Lauren. Look, I think it's, again, we've been here for a while, so we've been watching this, what we've been saying, the wave's been building for a while around this particular topic. And I think it's probably, well, clearly it's as ripe as it's ever been in terms of having these type of discussions. But look, I think within the next couple of years, I mean, competitive advantage is one thing. I think as we've sort of gone through today, having a level of carbon literacy on the logistics side to be able to communicate with your freight customers is going to become really important. And I do see that as a competitive advantage. Do you become a more preferred supplier because you are able to have those conversations and deliver that information through to your customers? Yes, I think that's a competitive advantage. Eventually it'll be a regulatory issue, or it'll be, at some point it'll be mandated that everyone's got to play by the rules. So that will be, the adoption curve will come out the back and will be sort of wide scale. But I think within the next couple of years, we're really going to see, as we've seen, you've probably got chunks of the market now that are already looking for this, perhaps whether they know it or not. And this is sort of bridging that gap between logistics and sustainability. So having, again, more carbon literacy on our logistics side will help the sustainability people understand who to partner with and how to go about that. So yeah, I think we're definitely in that window now.
Michael, can you talk a bit about the European carbon adjustment mechanism, which is coming in? And of course, Australia doesn't manufacture as much as it used to, and probably doesn't export into Europe as much, but certainly in Asia, it's very high profile about having to, know your carbon that's in each product, so it can be penalised less when it goes through the border in Europe. Are you seeing much movement in this area at the moment?
Well, obviously, global political situation is shifting things a little bit, but and Australia there's a discussion or work being done around a carbon border adjustment mechanism in Australia. But so just briefly, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which was introduced in Europe. Again, we're looking at one in Australia. It was introduced as a mechanism in Europe because Europe obviously acts under a carbon market at the minute. It's a regulatory market where, let's say we're producing widgets in Europe, we have a requirement to pay a carbon price against producing those widgets within Europe, which obviously impacts the shelf price of those widgets. What the European market have implemented is this CBAM, which effectively tries to cut off, as we call it, carbon leakage, where effectively an importer would get widgets from a market that's not operating on a sort of a carbon regulatory environment. Say, for instance, China, import those into the country at a lower price point, undercutting the price point of the European-made widget, which was sort of caught within the carbon carbon market and carbon costs. So this is an interesting global dynamic that's evolving. Australia is looking at this also, particularly as we start to get wider scale. The regulatory market has deeper impact, and we have more companies being caught under the framework to protect certain industries. It will be a mechanism that Australia will, I would imagine, will have to introduce at some point. So obviously within that, you know, those embodied carbon products coming from offshore, part of that is logistics. So understanding what is the logistics component of these products moving around the place. But yeah, it's an interesting area, and perhaps the momentum shifted a little bit in the last sort of 12 months, but I think that they will be here to stay as different global markets try and start to interact around trade and protect where we have compliance markets in place.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, Andrew here. Absolutely agree with that, Michael. And just building on it and returning it to the topic we had earlier on. When you think about it, the ASRS reporting rules, which are based on the International Financial Reporting System, IFRS S1, S2, that provides a level of visibility increasingly over the next 5, 6, 7 years, which enables the public to start to see some of those numbers and enables other jurisdictions to see what those sort of numbers are. And I guess I'd just like to also point out one other thing. Whilst at the moment we live in a world where there's a lot of pushback on environmental matters, principally out of the US, I don't think we should lose sight of the ability of public pressure and just embarrassment to drive behaviour. So a war story here. Early carbon reporting, and an entity had some numbers out there in a public presentation, and we were helping them put it together. And about 7% of their emissions was from about 0.5% of their turnover, this particular operation. So I go in the next year to help them prepare their report, and I noticed that this line item is missing from the report, and I'm thinking, I must have forgotten to put it in. And the response came back from the operations general manager, no, we closed that. You did? He said, yeah, it was a bit embarrassing, really. Made us look a bit desperate. And so we decided just to close that in until we could really fix that up and come back and bring that back on stream. So public availability of data does have a way of feeding through into behaviour. I'd just like to put that one on the table. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Brandon's put a question in there. Do you think a cap and trade system like the EU emissions trading system is an effective tool to incentivise decarb? And take us there.
Well, I might just jump into that before Michael answers from the transport and European point of view. When you look at it, the safeguard mechanism and the ability to earn safeguard mechanism credits, it has in fact morphed into a cap and trade system, albeit only for the 200 some largest emitting facilities. So I think the world is actually going to look at Australia's safeguard mechanism credit system over the next 5, 7 years, and we're going to be part of the answer to that, whether or not people decarbonise or just pay the bill.
Yeah, well, I think from my perspective, it simplifies things a lot. If there's a universal carbon price, this question around it takes a lot of questions out of the subject in the sense that there becomes a price for being inefficient. And if you're willing to, as Andrew says, you can either pay for it or become more efficient and lower the price. So those questions around how do we differentiate, are we competitive or not? Yeah, I think it does simplify things a lot when if we have a universal price, and obviously the framework for the cap and trade is there now. It's just obviously capturing more entities would be the pathway sort of to that outcome. But certainly I think that would make things a lot clearer.
Yeah, and it's interesting with, you say universal price, but even within, carbon credits, there's gold standard, and there's cheap offsets you can get. This is in a global system, so the price of carbon can have different prices depending on where it comes from or what the activities are. And if you apply the similar concept into putting electric trucks on the road in your freight supply chain, I mentioned before, what's the green premium to put those trucks in, or any other decarbonisation pathway you choose. There's a cost. We call it the green premium, that context, but it's different for every company, because every company and every supply chain has got different dynamics which need to be addressed. So that green premium is not a single number, and it's different everywhere.
True.
In the absence of more questions and getting you all back to your day jobs, we are going to cut the webinar now. The gents kindly provided their emails on the presentations, and we'll be sending you those presentations later and uploading also the taped version of today's webinar to our QTLC webpage. We appreciate that we didn't get to all of the fleets who we really want this information to go to today. So please do circulate this information as you like, come back to us, ask questions. The Future Freight Energy Hub program is as good as we make it. So if you feel that there are unanswered questions or there's alleyways that we need to roll down, then please let us know. We are always about what information there are, what gaps in the market there are, and how do we plug those. I want to thank our speakers today, Andrew, David and Michael, for sharing their time. We don't pay them. They come on here free of charge, not to flog their services, but to fill that gap and the void so that we can have the best prepared freight system in the world. So we appreciate it's a complex web that is there, but they did a great job today in providing clear, plain English explanations. And if you feel that there's more to be answered there, please let us know, as we say. So please go to our website, qtlc.com.au. We've got PowerPoints there. We've got the previous newsletters there with a whole bundle of technical content. Sing out by phone or email if you've got any queries. Thank you for coming along, and have a happy Tuesday afternoon. Again, thank you to our presenters.
Thank you.